Hi, my name is Margaret Smith. I'm a Program Analyst 1 here at the DOT. I work under Fernanda in the HPA unit, and I'm going to turn it back over to her to get started.
So today we're going to talk about how we started. We're going to talk about the validations, the process of how to write the validations. Also, you're gonna learn that we break down the validations into big stacks, the business validation and the HPMS validations. Also, we're gonna talk about the test case. Those test cases, what we use to make sure validations are sharp. So we're gonna show about the running validation process. We're gonna analyze some of the results and see how we analyze the results. And after that, we're gonna talk about everything we learn on this process. Okay, how we started. Well, in 2021, due some employees turnover, we inherited the HPMS process. So at that time, we have very little knowledge of what this process was and all the data involving it. And all the documentation we had in the process at the time was using a SQL database as a source of the data for the submission of the HPMS within about like 7 to 8 tables. So at that time, we had basically this SQL database was used as the source of the HPMS, but also we had a parallel geospatial database that was maintained by the LRS unit that was receiving double entry. So basically, we would re-enter or process the chains of the roads in 2 places at a time. We would do that on the SQL database, and we would do that on the geospatial as well. So the idea always was we would go and migrate eventually the data source to go to the geospatial database. But due to the turnover of the employees, that process was speeded up. So we heritage the HPMS, and we had to make the executive decision of migrate to a new data source. So when we face with that challenge, we start learning about the HPMS process and all the overlay we had to do. Remember, the SQL database had about 7 to 8 tables because each table contained more than one attribute, while in the LRS, basically every attribute is a layer and every layer is a table. So we had to get a table that have like 5 attributes. That means that we have to overlay 5 layers or join 5 tables, right? So basically this process was speeded up because the turnover of the employees, and we start studying and transcript the documentation, and also so then when we start doing that, remember the LRS was not being used to this purpose. So when we start drawing and combine all these different layers that talk about the same information or point to the same direction, like through lanes and pavement width and all of those things, we realized that the data we have on the LRS was great, but not perfect. So and the process we had at the time for QA/QC was a manual process. So imagine this, like over 70 layers, over 38,000 miles, and with this cross validations that are necessary to guarantee that data is pointing to the same direction and all the data converge to the same final information, is not humanly possible to do all of this manually. So we thought must have a better way to do this. So inspired by Ohio and Thank you, Aaron, for inviting us to talk here. Ohio had a great presentation on their use of FME to generate the data items for HPMS, and I'm very much simplify their presentation here. But seeing what they are using FME for and how they were able to create a great solution for them there, we realized FME may be the solution for us. So FME extends, I think everybody here knows, but feature manipulation engine is a ATL2, extract, transform, and load tool. So very much inspired by Ohio, we partnership with Gistic, and I think Bo is on the call. So shout for Bo. And we begin to design our solution. Automate process that validates the LRS information and feeds to our needs, allow us to write more validations easily in the future, adding things to it, and it's great. So Margaret will explain a little bit more about the validation process, and I'll talk to you guys later.
So of our validations, we have about 175 rules validations right now, and we keep those in an Excel document. Now, as we said before, those rules are split into two categories. We have our general rules and our HPMS rules. Our general rules are rules that are specifically important to West Virginia. They are rules that we just run more often, and there is some overlap between the requirements for HPMS and the West Virginia rules, but because we found them so important to us, we classify them as general rules. And the other half of our rules, the HPMS rules, those are ones that are specifically tailored to HPMS. They involve like samples, medium type, medium width, things like that. We also separate our rules based on the layers involved. As we said before, the layers are just how we separate the data. So F system gets a layer, facility gets a layer, urban codes, they all have their own layers. And so if we were to do this by hand, you would have to look at each of those individually. So when I say we separate them based on layers, we separate them into single layers and cross layers. Our single layers are things like domain checks. They're things that just happen in one layer. You don't have to overlay anything. But our most important rules are our cross layers because they are so complicated and because they would be the most time consuming to do by hand and how many things you would have to keep track of. And our validations are written in if-then format. This is just so that they're easier to read and easier to write, especially for people who are not super familiar with SQL statements, because in the end, you have to negate the SQL statement, which is a lot harder to read than just an if-then statement. So when you're actually writing the validations, you would write them in the Excel document, and then you'd put them into FME. This FME workspace is going to read the document, and then it's going to do some rudimentary QA/QC, and that's just to make sure everything is formatted correctly, that all the fields are filled out, that there's no duplicates, stuff like that. And then what it's going to do is it's going to make the actual SQL statements that we're going to use later on, and it's going to put them in a database for FME to use later. So the general workflow is that either the LRS unit or the HPMS unit will figure out that we need a new rule. They're going to put it in the Excel document, run that FME. The FME then writes the SQL to the database. So when I say HPMS, I mean specifically this like HPMS 9 validations. So HPMS and FHWA will release their validations in a zip file that's updated periodically, and we will be on the search for it. We will download it, and this is things that are like spatial join full CSV, a domain road events complete CSV, and that just has all of validations in those specific sections. So what we'll do is every time that those CSVs are updated, we'll go through the validations and we'll see whether or not we have a rule for it already, or if we need to update, adjust an existing rule. So like this picture here, this is an example of one of the CSVs or a section of the CSV, and it's basically saying that F system must exist where facility type is 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and that F system must exist and must not be null in those locations. So from that, we will then make an if-then statement and put it in the Excel document and go forward. Now, after we create all these rules, we then alert the LRS team to it, and then as both HPA, HPMS, and LRS, we will determine whether or not it is a business rule or general rule or an HPMS rule. And so then, as we mentioned before, we have our test cases. The test cases are purely to make sure that the rule is doing what we want it to do. So in this case, what we do is we make up data so that we can confirm this. So the rule ID just corresponds to the rule ID in the validation itself. The case ID is how we differentiate how many things we're actually testing for this one rule. So in this case, we have A and B, but some validations are more complicated, so they would have more than 2 test cases. The layer, they correspond to the value, but they also are there to mimic the LRS data to make sure that's all working correctly. The route ID, that is again to mimic the LRS, but it's also because some of our more West Virginia specific validations are dependent on a section or a substring of the route ID. The RH to date is because we keep historic data with our current data. We will use this column to validate that the section is working correctly and that we are only collecting current data. And again, to mimic the LRS, the from measure to measure are just to make sure that those properties in our workspace are working correctly. The expected column is to determine whether or not we expect that rule to pass or fail. And so to keep track of false positives and false negatives. This data here is what corresponds to the layer, and that's why you see the dashes and you see the null. But they are to confirm that the fake data we are putting in is working as it should. Now, this is the biggest benefit to having the test cases here, is so that we can keep track of making sure we're not getting false positives. Because we can more or less keep track of false positives, because once you start going through the errors, we can find things that should not have been flagged but were, but false positives are a lot more difficult. So again, we're to make sure that our rules are working as we intend, and this section here is would be an example of when we had a false positive. Now this could be anything to do with our test cases was a little off or our validation was a little off. And from there we can go in and figure out what exactly is going on. So when we talk about actually running the validations, this is just a snapshot of that workspace. That workspace is much, much larger. But one of the great things about FME and the way we use FME is how dynamic it is. So from my point of view, as somebody who's working a lot more with the rules, I can run a rule, a very specific rule or a subset of rules. But somebody who's working with the data can run, say, if there's a change to surface type, they can run just the layer surface type and be able to gather all of the rules that involve surface type, which is one of the great things and one of the best things I think we did switching to FME, was because there are so many things to keep track of that would be almost physically impossible to do. Our else team did a great job doing it though. Kudos to them. Yeah. Um, so our workflow is generally the same as before. So it'll read the SQL database, it'll find the statements we made earlier, and it'll pull whatever you need for them. So it'll pull the layers you need, it'll make sure that the the RH to date is null is correct. And so it'll put all of the overlay data into its SQL database, run that specific SQL statement against the database, and then it we'll put everything in one report so that way our LR's team can go and figure out what is going on with our data. So these are the results we would normally get. It's split into two sections. We have an overview, which is just confirms that the rule was run correctly, and it'll also establish that, yes, there are no errors with that specific rule. It's also split up in, so we have our summary section, we have our detail section. Our detail section is a lot more detailed, and it will explain the exact road segment, the rule, and basically where to find the error that's in the data, so that way our LS team can evaluate what is going on with that specific segment of road. This allows the LRS team to QA, QC the data a lot faster and a lot more accurate than they would have been doing by hand. And in the end, we really value good data because it's better not only in an HPMS standpoint, but it's just better for the people who use West Virginia data. And we really, value the people who do that. So I'm going to turn this back over to Fernanda to close us out.
Thank you, Margaret. So I think one of the biggest things that we learn throughout this process and the few years that we are working on this is as a cultural change. I believe that in the beginning, when we point some controversy on the data, people are worried that we are trying to find people to blame, and I see now that everybody understands that the goal is data excellence. So we want all to have the best data we can, and have the data that point to the same direction and is smooth. It doesn't have conflicts. So I see that, and it's a great thing because we are our goal is to have the best data we can and not find anybody to blame, because we all in the same boat. So if I see a problem and I do not report the problem, I'm part of the problem. So if I see something that's a controversy on the data and I don't pass that to the team that manipulate the data so they can fix it, I'm part of the problem. So and I see that everybody understand that better now. The other thing is the smooth QA/QC process. Have all the we have over 100 validations, right? So have this much validations and expect that someone would do all of this manually. It's for me not possible. I would not like to have that job. To have the pressure to run out those validations by hand, that's a big no-no. So with automation, imagine have to remember 100 and over 100 validations to do manually. So with automation, we don't have the problem of forgetting something, because when you run, you just select everything. You can even let running overnight and check the results in the morning, or run and go to lunch, and so you don't have the problem of having to spend energy running the process. You just have to evaluate the results. The increase of the data quality. Of course, our data was great, since the beginning. LRS team, kudos for you guys. Before these validations, the quality that you guys maintain on this data is phenomenal. But with the validations, we can increase that and release the stress, because it's a big responsibility to have data that's used for all the state plus the federal. So being able to minimize the stress on the LRS team and provide better quality while we're doing, I think that's phenomenal. So the current LRS is public twice a year. So this is other thing that smooth out. Maybe I put stress free there. Maybe it's not our stress free for the LRS team, but it's still having the validations. I'm sure help a lot to minimize the stress, to guarantee that we publish good data. You just need to run the validations until you get no validations to be flagged, and you pretty good data, as good as can get as far as our knowledge go, right? Since we are always create more validations if we see the need. So the data is always going to be as good as can get when we run other validations and have no issues flagged. Other thing is the power of FME, right? Margaret and I have a computer science background, but a lot of our coworkers, we work with a lot of GIS folks. So FME provides a much more friendly environment for beginners. I use a lot of Python, or used to use a lot of Python and Pandas, um, and Margaret as well. But like, I know that can be very intimidate for new people, for beginners, because like open terminal and running commands and like that can be pretty scary and also harder to read for beginners, right? If you're gonna heritage a big project on Python, can be very intimidating to run. So with FME, I feel that, well, I just don't feel. I see people doing here that is much more projects and people using FME to solve data analysis and little projects that they are doing here. GIS folks are using for many projects that they have here and being very successful. I saw that we had a question in the chat. I'll take a look on that. Yeah, thank you, Margaret. We're gonna go to questions, but when West Virginia implement these validations, how was your data? Did you have a lot of errors that you hadn't caught, or it was generally clean? That was pretty much clean, because basically, so we start with the HFMS in 2021, right? So basically, all these overlays that or the big overlays for the layers that are full extension, we had to do those for, like, when you go to generate the data for the certified public mileage, you have to evaluate or uh, several layers, so kind of like 8 main layers, if I'm not super wrong, something around that. And Margaret, please jump in if I'm saying something wrong. But so basically, when you do that, you kind of filter out the data for the state, and things need to convey to the same direction, right? Because like if you say that those roads are main direction and the interstate and the F system values need to match, so all those things go and we had pretty good data. We had I think was that we found little things and we talked to the team and get them to adjust. But that was the first time that LRS was used to that purpose, and we find what I think 2 little things that was like we had to forward to the team to adjust, and we just have been better and better every year. But I believe that the LRS implementation of the validations was done in 2023. Is that correct, Margaret?
That sounds right to me.
Okay, so I don't know if we got that. I think it was after the HMS season, right?
Yes, I think it would have been
So
October or so when we first started with the October of 23 is when we started a lot with the validations.
yeah, so I think the last year was the first year that we submit HPMS with the validations in place. So basically, we have done maybe 2 publications with the validations in place for LRS. I think something like that. So yeah, things have been improved, but was not that off. No, thankfully, like again, I said, the guys working hard on the LRS to keep the data good quality for sure.
And I
And
will add to that, sorry,
go ahead.
the errors we did have, they would have been extremely small segments, like 0.05 miles of an error. And when you think about in the context of 38,000 public miles in West Virginia, it would be incredibly difficult to see that kind of thing doing validations by hand.
Any other questions?
People can feel free to unmute if you'd like, or type any questions in the chat. Thank you for your presentation, you guys. I know that at Ohio, when we finally got our HPMS validations up and running, that annual submission that we make every year, probably most people on this call are familiar with HPMS, but for those of you who aren't, it's just a big data submission to the Federal Highway Administration that all DOTs have to make every year. And before we had our validations in place at Ohio, it was a little bit of a struggle because, you know, we would rely on the HPMS software to do our validations and then scramble around to make everything fit so that we could submit our data. And this way, it's not a mad rush. We've got everything in place before the submission. So that's, like you said, that alleviates a lot of the stress. Ethan, let's see, type in the chat. He said, might have missed it, but how are you running these? On FME server or locally through an FME app?
Currently, we are running them locally on the FME desktop. We do have plans in the future to make them more automated, to make them run through FME Flow, but at this time, we run them as needed.
Okay, great. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Otherwise, I'll just say thanks again, West Virginia, for presenting, and glad you've got these in place to make your, oh, Ryan, I see you got your hand raised. Do you want to unmute?
Yep, sure. Just a quick question. So you said you run this twice a year. So when you run that, what is your correction cycle look like, and how long is that? Like if you run it one time and you have some errors, you know, does that take like a week, and then you fix those errors and rerun it again? It's another week before you're satisfied with all of it, or is it a much quicker turnaround because your data has been good all along?
Basically, to run the process is on demand. So basically what we have here is like the publication of the LRS is done twice a year. So that means we have, and I'm not the GIS person, but I will try to explain and do my best if Aaron is here and you want to jump in. But basically, what happens is the LRS is a geospatial database, and we have the LRS publication, and we have the LRS or LRS pub, and we have the transactional. The transactional is where the changes happen, and the changes happen constantly. So basically, any information that we get from the districts to telling us that they resurface a road, they can submit in a form for us to update the surface type and things like that. Or also if we have a change going on in a road, or a road was built or something like those things, they have submit papers so we can change the line of the road into the LRS. So those things are constantly happening. Basically, the person that's processed those documents, once they have processed few documents, they run the validation and they evaluate the results. Or like Margaret said, they may even I'm just changing the surface type on several roads. I'm just going to run the surface type validations or all the validations for the surface type and see if anything flagged. So if those, they run, fix, and run again and until they are satisfied with the process. And then for the publication, that's like a whole team effort in a sense of like the chains are stopped. So everybody gonna work to make sure that the data is good, but should be kept already in a good state, right? So to facilitate that transition. But they run the validations until that's good, or no things are flagged, or if so, is a it need to be something ever flagged issue must be analyzed, right? So and fixed ideally. So then when that all satisfy, they push that to the publication, and that data become available to the public in West Virginia. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yep.
I do just want to
Thank
add
you.
to that real quick. Because the workspace is so dynamic, like we were talking about, actually running the workspace, which is I think the most impressive part, is it'll take anywhere from, if you're running all of the rules, it probably takes about an hour and a half, but if you're just running a couple, it takes like 10 minutes to run the validations. And as someone who does not do a lot of GIS stuff, but having to work with it intermittently, I think that's probably the coolest part of that. Sorry.
All right, we have another hand raised. Bo, do you want to unmute? Bo, I'm not sure if you can hear me. If you can unmute and ask your question, or otherwise you can type in the chat. I'm not sure if you had a question or comment. All right, well, while we're waiting to see if Bo has something to add, anyone else have any questions, comments about the presentation? Oh, Bo has a problem with his mic. Oh, okay. Sounds good. See if Bo can join us and ask his question or provide his comment here. See, we've got another post in another text in the chat. Aaron says, to follow up on Ryan's timeline question, as we get closer to the publication, we try to turn around the edits within a few days. Sometimes we will fix validation errors alongside the ongoing LRS edits, especially if the edits are cartographic only and won't impact the invalid events. Thanks, Aaron, for that clarification. Bo, are you back on?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we could hear you.
Great. I have two comments to make. I think one thing is no one likes errors in their data. But what I have observed from West Virginia, they don't tolerate error. I think that mentality, made it so easy for when Gistic stepped in to work with them to make this project so successful. So that's comment number one. Comment number two, I think I think Ryan was asking about the application, whether it's using, Flow app or desktop app. And I think our strategy at West Virginia is for those specific, highly technical processes, we like to use desktop because we only have one or two people using it. And in that way, we can leave the critical kind of flow engine resource for more general use, right? Because when you consume desktop licenses and, in fact, in desktop, you can have up to 8 engines to use. So it's actually very economical. So yeah, that's what I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Bo. All right. Well, if there are no more questions or comments about the presentation we saw today, just another thank you to Fernanda and Margaret for presenting. Really appreciate you guys taking the time today and sharing this cool work that you're doing in West Virginia. All right, well, I will keep everyone posted about our next quarterly meeting. We're always looking for folks to showcase what they're doing, share tips and tricks. So reach out to me if you'd like to be involved in a future presentation. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks. Stay warm out there, everybody.
Thank you. You guys have a good
Thank
one.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.